I'm going to try and pick up basically where I left off last time. Basically, the note that I left off on last time was the restoration of this mystery. Basically, last time I spent a lot of time talking about how you start with faith and believing the scriptures. It's hard to say at face value. Face value can be a lot of things, but I'm saying that if you understand that the book is a mystery, and there's lots of parables to this effect. You seek for it as hidden treasure, and that kind of thing. So when I say you take it at face value, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be quote unquote fundamentalist about it. The traditional view of fundamentalists is that creation is a literal 7 days, and there was a literal flood. And basically what I'm saying is it's not my place to try and dispute that. Whether that happened or not is really beyond any human being's capacity to know, because you're talking about it in terms of reality, you're talking about it in terms of history, you're talking, in a lot of ways, even though you're talking about faith, you're talking about faith in terms of actual human history and the actual course of human events. And what I'm suggesting is that you really don't need to pin down those things one way or the other. If you want to believe 7 literal days, then that really doesn't bear too much on what I would consider to be the more certain meaning, and that would be the parabolic. Now, it does seem a bit ironic to say that the parabolic is the more certain meaning, but what I'm saying is that's what's important about what I like to call keys. That certain words basically mean certain things all the time, and so once you find that there's a key that's given, like for example, in one of his books, Paul says the washing of water by the word, and in 2 Peter you see that when Peter's referring to the flood, he says that just as the earth was destroyed by the waters in those days, I'm paraphrasing, he says that so also is this world, this age, reserved for destruction by that same word. So again, you have this very close association with the word water and word. And in one of my parables, one of the earlier tracts, I talked about how Jude starts out by talking about these people that have crept into the church, and so we call them the infiltrators, or the betrayers, I guess is probably another good way of looking at it. He never stops talking about these people. Throughout all 25 verses, basically talking about these guys. It really hardly changes the subject, and he uses example after example, primarily out of old or apocryphal books in Old Testament literature. And anyway, he makes reference to these people, and then he calls them wild waves of the sea. And so naturally you get this association with these men and the wild waves of the sea. Well, there's a key too. You can go back into one of the the New Testament situations where Jesus is walking across the water and he's about to pass up these guys, the apostles, and they see him and they call out to him, and Peter says, "If it's you, then why don't you call out to me?" Well, Peter, as I discussed in one of my other tracts, is the church. And so Jesus, being the Word, calls Peter to him. So as Peter gets out of the boat, starts walking towards Jesus, the Word, what comes up? The winds and the waves. So when you think the waves, the wild waves, then you see that the wild waves mean these infiltrators of the church. You can see how the church gives way to these infiltrators. He starts sinking into the water. And basically the final touch to this basically is the winds. Paul talks about do not be blown about by every wind of doctrine. So if you simply take that at face value and say, okay, in this case what Paul's talking about is doctrine. When he says wind, when you see the winds, then you see doctrine, and when you see the waves, you see these infiltrators. So when the church starts to go towards Jesus, which is the Word in its entirety, and the Word in all of its perfection, the closer it gets to that goal, the more the wind, that is these false doctrines, and the waves, that is these infiltrators, become a threat to Peter, who is the church. And so naturally, taking those words at face value provides an excellent insight into what I'm affirming to be the truth, and that is that all of these books were inspired. But because the parable is framed that way, obviously the church had to give way, and obviously the Word in its entirety had to pull Peter, the church, up out of the water, which is, and in this case, because of the way that Jesus goes from one end to the other, and how Peter and the other disciples go from one end to the other, really represents the church age. And so the waters would be the whole history and the whole nations of the earth. And one of the Psalms, it says that the roaring of the waves and the roaring of the people, so it's not hard to see how sea can be the roaring of the people in this particular case. But it's this time passage from point A to point B, reaching from the beginning all the way to the goal, and that's where he's going, is to the other side. And so that's sort of a paradigm of us going from the beginning of the church age to the end of the church age. And somewhere along the way, this conflict took place. And oddly enough, it states in Mark, I think it is, that as soon as Jesus, the whole Word, entered into the boat with Peter, that is to say, with the church, they immediately reached the other side. So that firmly establishes the very end of that parable, or the very end of that picture, the idea that once you take this entire Word, or the Word in its entirety, and you bring it into the fold, so to speak, and that it has after it has rescued the church from the wind and the waves of the false doctrine and these infiltrators, once it's rescued it from that you ultimately reach the goal. And so that's when the kingdom is, or that's when the kingdom begins. So anyway, having kind of paraphrased and summarized, some of the foregoing, I'd like to move on. My inspiration to put all of these books together into one single thing really started with 2 Peter and Jude. 2 Peter and Jude was really my first revelation. It started innocent enough, realizing that the two books had so much similarity, and that the one was apparently dependent upon the other, that the one used the other, that Peter used Jude in order to better. I started out simply by taking the two books and reading them kind of, paragraph by paragraph. And I noticed that there were things in this paragraph that I wanted to see over in this paragraph, and there were things that were in this paragraph that I wanted to see over in this paragraph, because I wanted to see sort of a paragraph with all of the information, and be able to read it like that. And so it dawned on me that what I needed to do is make, a few copies of both of these books. They were short enough, and I thought, well, it wouldn't take more than a couple of days, really, to get to the bottom of this. And so I figured, what the heck, just do it, just see what it looked like. And I did it a couple of different ways. I did one where I took all of the Jude material and transferred it over into the Peter material, and then I took the Peter material that wasn't in Jude, and I transferred it over into the Jude. And it came up with almost the same letter in both cases. Then I sequenced them so that the stuff that had no parallel in Jude from Peter, I went ahead and put into Jude, and the stuff that had no parallel in Peter from Jude, I went ahead and put it in Jude, and the letter became even more homogeneous. And finally, I just decided that I was going to basically do a complete version of both books. And when I did that, the thought occurred to me that people have tried to do this with the synoptic gospels, and of course they'd come up with a harmony of the four gospels, and there's lots of those out there. So it really didn't dawn on me immediately that there was anything all that groundbreaking in it. But it slowly but surely occurred to me that there were other books that I wanted to integrate the same way that I wanted to integrate Peter and Jude. Namely, some of the early infancy gospels, the infancy gospel of Jesus, and the birth of Mary, and the various other gospels. And so here's one of the original actual manuscripts that I did with those particular books, I should say. You'll find that this is cut and paste. I just took and reduced some of these copies. And here's what you get. You get, of course, the prologue of John and the prologue of Luke. I've since switched those around. This is part of the fine-tuning of the whole thing. But I did a really coarse sample at first. And I started noticing, like, for example, after this, which is canonical material, excuse me, I saw that this material really needed to be integrated with this material, and that this material needed to be integrated in this. But there were other things I noticed as well. This is one section here, and it continues in this middle section, and then it continues on into this third section. The part that really got me wondering, the part that really got me going, was not so much the parallel parts, but the way in which, for example, Luke would flow into John, which would flow into, let's say, the birth of Mary, and into the Proto-Evangelion, and so on and so forth. That alternation was the most interesting aspect of this whole thing. Because when a story basically goes from here to here in one source, as you can see, but the other source can contain some in-between material, but really no parallel. In other words, this isn't just this and this with a little bit of this. It's just this. And this isn't really just this minus this. I mean, it's this and it jumps right to there and jumps right to there, without any reference in itself to this material. See, this material supplements this. But you see that you don't just find this in isolation. That what you actually find, and there's some really good examples right here on the next page, is that you get this long story that it basically ends here with just a little bit of overlap here, and it continues on from this point down. But what's interesting is that the details harmonize to such an extent that we literally jump from this one to this one, back to this one, back to this one, back to this one, back to this one, and back to this one, and then it goes on for some time by itself. But then the pattern picks up again, from this one to this one to this one to this one to this, and so on and so forth. And just the moment that I started seeing this, and this particular version of it isn't really correct, or at least as correct as what I've fine-tuned it down into, it was enough for me to recognize and to realize that really one of two possibilities existed. That there was either some master plan on the part of various authors to make sure that you read this material with this material. Because again, and this is kind of a hard point to absorb, but try to imagine what I'm saying here. If it was the intention of this author to harmonize with this author, or if it was the intention of this author to harmonize with this author, then by leaving out certain points, certain crucial things that you need to understand in order to get the point of what he's trying to say, he's in effect saying, look, you need this stuff to fill in the gaps. Or this guy's saying, you need this stuff to fill in the gaps. So whichever one wrote the later version of it would have had to have gone through all this and said, look, I'm not going to write what he wrote all the way through. I'm going to supplement it. I'm going to do it in little bits and pieces, like I'll repeat it here and I'll repeat it here. But I'm going to go ahead and provide a lot of data that isn't here, such that a person would get a sneaking suspicion that this was intentional. So if it was that, then you've maybe hit upon one of the mysteries of the way that people wrote scriptures way back when, was to supplement the things that the other person said. This person didn't attempt to write a super gospel. This person didn't attempt to take everything they knew and integrate it all into one big thing like I've done. Okay, this person wanted to write partially, and this person maybe wanted to write partially as well, or vice versa, whatever the case may be. But the point is that there was something of the mystery still left in the way that you can see by design that this was the writer's intention. But the other possibility, one that's even more intriguing, is the possibility that, and again, you see it again and again and again throughout these two books in particular, just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, just like that. And it really struck me that the other possibility was that simply it was inspired that way. And if this was something that the Holy Spirit had inspired, then we have to agree that this was God writing it, and that God gave you a little here, and 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 a little here. Basically saying to you, look, you need to put this over here, and this over here. I mean, that's the implicit message here. Just to go back and forth between the two. So what he's like saying, he's almost begging you, put it together. Okay? And so once I started seeing that, and seeing it over and over again, just a constant in and out between these documents. And maybe this doesn't do it much justice, but I mean, so much is supplemented here in one book and not the other, that I was just convinced. And so I went on ahead with my plan to integrate the first part of the gospel, which is the infancy part, when Jesus was young, before he was born even. Because there's lots of material to that effect that still remains to us. The next step was to do this on the level of the entire gospel. As you can see, on my revision B, the second cut and paste that I did, I went ahead and got a little more sophisticated. First of all, I went ahead and I switched John and Luke, because this was more of an editorial comment and, a comment about his intentions. So it basically bears on all of Luke. But I thought it was an appropriate thing to begin a whole gospel that was like this, because what he says is, and this is kind of the King James version of it, he says, "For as much as many have taken in hand to draw up a narrative concerning those matters which have been fulfilled among us, even as they delivered them unto us, who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having traced the course of all things accurately from the first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus," which means lover of God, "that you might know the certainty concerning the things wherein thou wast instructed." So, basically reading between the lines is, what Luke is saying about his own gospel may in fact be true about all the gospels. And so when it sits up here in this gospel, it not only refers to the Lucan sections, but really to the John and to the birth of Mary and to the Protevangelion and James and to all the gospels that go into this. So he could be talking about a whole big super gospel here. And that would be instruction number 1. Instruction number 2 would be John's introduction. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and so on and so forth. And then we see how once I've taken this a step further and actually integrated the things together, I was able to come up with a more and more coherent story. So it just got clearer and clearer that, see, like here, this is one translation, this big, long, thin one, that's out of one book, and these wider ones are out of another book. And these gaps that you see here, those are places where one book ends and another book begins, and so on and so forth. And you can see there's lots of these little gaps here, which means that's a snip out of something else entirely. So the intricacies involved are amazing, and the consistencies that show up are also amazing, so that one does become very suspicious that of the possibility that this was a conspiracy. Because if it was a conspiracy of maybe 70, 80, 90 persons scattered out over maybe hundreds of years. And in either case, if it was a conspiracy, that all these people worked together to do this, it still shows that that was the mystery of Christianity. And if it's inspired, it reveals that it was in fact the mystery of God. So you really have the one possibility that ultimately leads to the knowledge of the mystery, or the other way, and that ultimately leads to the knowledge of the mystery. And so it's kind of like the saying of Yogi Berra, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Because either one will lead you ultimately to the same conclusion. Because following the conspiracy theory basically leads to an impossible situation. And so you immediately have to revert to the idea that this was an inspired way of writing. And if it was the inspired way of writing, then it's very strange, because it's like a mystery that's been hidden out in the open completely for the whole world to see. And, you know, just to show you how this permeates the entire book, let me see if I can show you. There are other pages, and this is hard to see because most of the other books are of the same, are full page length, so you don't see a lot of the changing of type styles and stuff, so it's a little hard to see. But let's see. Well, here's probably a pretty good page. I mean, you can see how where that gap is. That's where two paragraphs are spliced together. If you can see some of the darker print on here, this here, or that there, if that's at all clear to you, those are documents that are mixing together. And so, from kind of a structural standpoint, I was able to put together something that I thought, anyway, was utterly astounding and revolutionary and really quite breathtaking, in that it's so obvious on some level as to be amazing and almost unbelievable that nobody has ever gone through the time and effort to try and integrate these documents. And it's like I said before, it all comes back to two ways of understanding maybe the scriptures. The scholars, because scholarship is somewhat scientific, I don't want to say it's been corrupted by the science that underlies it, but it certainly has been limited. Because in scholarly circles, really, you don't want to talk about faith, and you don't want to talk about God or inspiration or any of those things, because it makes you sound like you're not scholarly, like you're not approaching it with a cool head. That maybe if you that maybe you're more of an evangelical than a scholar. And there's kind of this strict line that says in scholarship you have to be objective, okay? And once you start saying, well, you know, God is this and God does that and so on and so forth, you really cross over that line and back into the world of the evangelical, or to the older-fashioned theologian, as opposed to the biblical scholar, which is kind of in the ascendant today. Biblical scholars are good for a lot of things. They're good for researching documents, maybe ordering documents, restoring documents, finding documents, in some sense explaining documents. They can paint a cultural picture of the circumstances under which the document was written or probably written. And so I don't knock biblical scholarship at all. In fact, I'm all for it. I think that all of that work needs to be done. Texts need to be restored. And so, hats off to those people. They are to be commended for all of their hard work. But it's like a lot of things. It's more than that. And that's kind of my point. My point is not to argue against any kind of particular sect or any kind of particular way of looking at things per se. In my view of things, you can embrace the scholarly perspective, and you can embrace, on some level, the evangelical perspective. I'm a firm believer in Jesus Christ. I believe that he was, in fact, the Messiah, and is, in fact, the Messiah. But at the same time, it's not so much that I believe that these people have made a mistake, because I don't think the mistake was ever made. I think it was just meant to be a mystery that was lost and then found again. Much like the seed goes into the ground and you don't see it and it comes up. Well, the seed was always there and you didn't see the tree in it, but it doesn't mean that something went wrong. So if you say that Christianity went awry, then that really shows a lack of understanding, a lack of depth about your approach to what the mystery is. The mystery is, it is a seed, and it must die, and it must be buried, as it were, and it must grow, and Jesus gives a parable like that. He doesn't, man, sows something, he doesn't know how it grows, it just does. And what I'm saying is, well, this is kind of the seed, and maybe this. Now, the book that I wrote, it's kind of a long book, just in case you noticed, and I'm still in the editing phase here, as you can tell. But the parts that you can see here, this is all teeny tiny print. And I've got, 158 pages of really small print. That's basically non-redundant material. It encompasses Jesus' life from even before the time he was born, all the way back to his pre-existence. And the life of Mary's parents, the events in the lives of Mary's parents, Mary's birth, Mary's education in the temple, through the Annunciation, through the birth of Jesus, through the childhood of Jesus. At least one tantalizing hint about the activities of Jesus during the time that we normally call the lost years of Jesus, from the time he was maybe 12 or whatever until the time he was 30. We don't really know what happened to Jesus. We kind of lost track of him for those 18 years or whatever. It says he studied, of course, and he grew in the Lord. And that's about all it says, but it's there, so you kind of have that answer in a vague sense anyway. And there's lots of saying sources now, like the Gospel of Thomas, which is kind of a gospel of 114 different sayings, and most of them are just, Jesus said this, Jesus did that, and a few scattered parables and a few scattered, narrative events or whatever that happen. But mostly just sayings. Jesus said this and Jesus said that. There's other sources like patristic citations, which are normally called the agrapha, or the unwritten, even though they were written, just not in the scriptures. Jesus said this, Jesus said that. Most of these have an affinity, a very close relationship with the canonical documents. And so it's very clear, there's the one about don't cast your pearls before swine, and the Gospel of Thomas says something very similar to that. And so you see the pearls, you see the swine, you see the closeness of the paragraph, and you could just say, well, okay, here's the one and here's the other, and here they fit together. And so there's lots of things where naturally there's only one place, or if things take place in a narrative, for example, Jesus was 6 or 7 when this thing took place, this event took place. you know how to sequence it, because there are occasions where it says he was 6 and this happened, he was 7 and this happened, he was 8 and this happened, and then in the book it says and then he turned 8 and this happened, and so that all that stuff in the 7th year, for example, goes together with all the stuff in the 7th year of these other books, and so you find that you can kind of work out a sequence of events in those books as well, and so sequencing is another thing. Occasionally, there's not really a very good way of determining where something goes in the gospel, and you kind of have to resort to where it fits best. Where would Jesus have said this, or what's the closest example? Those are kind of iffy situations. I call them iffy because I feel like because the theory basically goes that it has to go somewhere, that the very best place that you can put something is in effect the place that it goes, kind of is begging the question. You have to accept that assumption in order to draw that conclusion, and so naturally it's open for debate. But in my mind, there's so much other evidence. The weight of this other evidence really does tend to indicate to me. It really does seem to say to me that is the inescapable conclusion, that you can't leave the material out, and that you shouldn't just leave it hanging randomly here and there, or slapped onto the end, or in some kind of footnote or something. That you should find the best place for it, the place where its meaning is most clear. And so you have to study the Word, and you have to study the whole gospel, and you have to understand what this phrase is trying to say. And once you can do that, you can find an apt situation for that phrase. A place where it seems natural, a place where it fits maybe the best. And Luke was very good at doing that. It was said of Matthew that he would take these sayings and form very long speeches out of these sayings, and that Luke would take these very same sayings, or some of the very same sayings, and find stories about Jesus or whatever where these sayings were appropriate. And he would use those sayings as a moral, let's say, of the story, or as a key to understanding the story. And so you find that Matthew and Luke, despite their other similarities, one had a tendency to relate stories, and the other had a tendency to speechify, if you will. And so they're both each valuable for the insights that they provide in, number one, showing you how a similar saying can go into one type of a situation, let's say a story situation, and the same moral or the same maxim or the same saying or the same proverb, if you will fit nicely into the context of a speech, like you have in Matthew. And so it's kind of a subtle indicator that it can really be both things, that a random maxim or a random saying, if you understand it well enough, can be taken and used in various contexts. And even though there is kind of a subjective dimension to that, and I have to kind of apologize for that, because there really is no other way for the theory to work. And I know in the minds of a lot of people, the whole theory is going to stand or fall on how objective you can be. I don't make any claims that this gospel is or can be what you would call absolutely perfect. But what I can say is that it can be optimized, and that has a lot of validity in and of itself. If I can optimize the usage of maxims, and I can optimize what I know about what Jesus did at certain ages, or where he was when he performed a certain event, I can narrow it down to 3 or 4 windows maybe. And I can say, well, it must belong in one of these windows. The last category and possibly the most questionable, although I don't question it that much, but it's it's an oddball story that doesn't actually have, that there's no way of knowing exactly where it does go. And so you kind of have to place it alongside another story and just sort of call it a parallel. In other words, now that we've thought about this and we know about the context of this, there's this other story that we don't really know where it goes, but it's so close to this other story that we might as well bring it up at the time. So it's kind of like when somebody's trying to teach you something and something else occurs to them, and they bring that other thing over into the story because it's similar enough or it's close enough that even though it may not have a quote-unquote right place, that is in effect the best place because of all the other places that it could go, because you don't know where it happens in the narrative, and you don't know where Jesus was when he said it, maybe, or under what circumstances the story came about. You can narrow it down to a best location. And again, that's part of the whole idea of optimizing the gospel. And this is what I've tried to do. I've tried very much to optimize it in every way, shape, or form. And so there's a hierarchy here. The easiest and the best ones are when there's whole sentences that are the same, or there's sentences that are mostly the same, or where a sentence begins and another one ends a thought. You can splice those together pretty easy. And so you kind of count those as very accurate or very reliable. And then there's other ones where the geography or some clue about the location or the stage of the ministry or the situation itself lends itself much more to one than to another. So definitely in the putting of this book together, there definitely is a subjective dimension. But like I said, there's sort of a hierarchy of rules, of things to follow. And as long as good sense is used, I don't see why many different people could not put together a very similar gospel to one another. That if you took 100 people and you said, look, these are the basic rules, we want to integrate all this material as completely as possible, there are going to be differences in the way that people did it. But I would caution against holding people like myself or whoever else might choose to do this up to too much scrutiny, lest we forget that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John lived very much closer to the source and to the origin of these events than we do. And their Gospels are very different and diverse. And even the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have very significant differences. For example, what I was saying before about an orphan story. There's a story about Jesus coming into the temple and turning over the money changer, the money and the animals, the money changers, and people that sold the animals and doves. Well, you have that very early on in John, and you have it later on in Matthew and Mark, in Luke, whatever, Matthew, Mark, Luke, which would tend to indicate one of two things. That Mark kind of put it someplace where he thought it would make the most sense, and John put it in a place where he thought it would make the most sense. Or an alternative would be that there really are two different events, that there are two places in which this happens. Now, even though that's possible, and I'm not questioning it at all, it just kind of gives you an idea as to the difficulties involved in trying to integrate even the canonical Gospels. The problems of integration that I found lied mostly in the canonical Gospels, In fact, it was a shock to me to find that most of the apocryphal gospels were easier to bring into line with one another than the canonicals were. And I kind of came to the conclusion that the gospels themselves were meant to be kind of tough nuts to crack, full of all kinds of problems and all kinds of conundrums, and all kinds of logical impasses, where you really couldn't say one thing happened before another, and you had to kind of pick and choose and take sides. And there are a few places, in my opinion, where the apocryphal gospels shed light on this. But I found that as a rule, the canonical gospels were much more difficult to integrate. And that's neither here nor there. That doesn't really prove that the apocryphal gospels are on par by itself. But what it does seem to indicate to me is that we cannot hold this double standard up and say, look, the four canonical gospels are one thing and the apocryphal gospels are another thing. What it seems to me like, and this is another deep insight that probably didn't dawn on me until much later when I was really into it, was that the kind of difficulties, the kind of contradictions, if you will, the kind of problems that existed in the canonical gospels might actually be for this one purpose, and that is to excuse the same sorts of difficulties, and I say that with quotes, or weaknesses, again in quotes, in the apocryphal gospels and all the apocryphal books. That if you could demonstrate that the canonical stuff was as problematic, if not more problematic, in certain respects than the apocryphal gospels, then what it, at the very least that it did, was to show, and maybe even to prove, that you cannot use those kinds of criteria, you know, the logical inconsistencies, the difficulties of sequencing, the fact that something is placed one place in one gospel and a totally different place in another gospel, that if these same features existed in the apocryphal gospels, in the apocryphal books, that you could not use that alone as a reason to exclude them. So from a certain point of view, from a certain standpoint, a person could say that these quote-unquote mistakes, these quote-unquote inconsistencies or whatever that exist within the canon, that's why they exist. Not to be perfect, but to create the basis for the forgiveness or the overlooking of these things in these other gospels. In other words, you can't say these are 100% in line with one another and there's 100% harmony between them, and there is no contradiction, and there are no difficulties. You know, John looks like it takes 3 whole years, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke only look like they take 1 year. You know, there's a big difference between 1 year and 3 years. You know, so if there's that much play in these documents that we call inspired, and we say, look, you know, this is God, and we give our stamp of approval to it, we would be very hypocritical then to scrutinize these books, these other books, to such a degree, and dig all the way down into the little minutia, and say, well, oh, we found a mistake, these can't be right. You know, you have to say that what God is trying to say in a roundabout kind of way, but one which is not too difficult to understand once you grasp the point it is I'm trying to say, that these so-called mistakes or these so-called inconsistencies or whatever were actually design elements that were intentional in order to undermine the argument against these other books on that basis, while at the same time providing for a certain time the ammunition, as it were, for the skeptics and the unbelievers and those people who oppose these apocryphal books to sort of slam them for a certain amount of time, to bring them down in terms of their status so that they're either not read or not taken seriously for a certain time, all on the pretense that there's something inferior about them when there's not. And to allow people, because that's the way people are, people tend to hold double standards. What I believe is right, what you believe is wrong. That's very common. And practically every religion in the world says something to that effect, even if they don't say it out loud. That is in effect what they're saying. That's why they believe what they believe. You know, they don't choose to believe what you believe because, well, they believe that they're right and you're wrong. And they might smile on your face, and they might go home and pray for you, and they might actually think you're a good guy, but they're not really going to come over to your side, more than likely, because they want to believe what they want to believe. And this tendency is rampant among human beings. And so, you know, naturally somebody spouts a party line, everybody goes in line with the party line, everybody believes it, and after a while it's true. No matter if it's true or not, it doesn't matter. People act as though it's true. And so you don't really have to have a whole lot of argument to get people to act a certain way. You really only have to have a lot of people believe in it. And that's kind of the story of, you know, all religion, really. But Christianity is not immune from that. That's all I'll say. But anyway, so once you can kind of get these books to, you know, the point where people look down on them, that's really all you need to do, and they're kind of removed from circulation, and they're not taken seriously anymore, and so on and so forth. But if you were to somehow bring them back up and try and find reasons for getting rid of them all over again, you would be at pains to try and separate canonical from apocryphal, because indeed there were some books that are now considered to be apocryphal that were very close to having made it into the scriptures, and there are books that we count as scripture today that were very close to not making it as scriptures. And so, you know, the people were not infallible, and there were popular books that were removed, and there were unpopular books that were kept. And I'm sure God had His reasons, and I don't question it, because God is God, and God has all that knowledge and all that power and everything to do it. But having said that, there would come a day when, of course, if these books were removed unfairly or unjustly, naturally, the truth would have to come out, because that's why it's hidden. Jesus says there's nothing hidden that is not to be revealed. So if facts are hidden, then facts are to be revealed. And so bringing this up, if indeed this is a viable theory, and if indeed this turns out to be right, then it's a lot like David and Goliath. You know, you can come at him, you can come at David with, you know, your biggest guy and with all your ammo or whatever, but with God's guidance, just one little stone can bring him down. You know, and maybe that's what this is. Maybe this is just a little bitty thing that turns into something really big, something really powerful, and maybe, just maybe, has the potential to maybe make things right. And that's kind of I'm sorry, I have such a cough. That's really what I'm aiming for. That's really what I'm hoping for, is to try and make things right. You know, I'm not coming to you with any kind of real agenda. I mean, I've been sitting on this for years, and I haven't so much as gone to a church, you know, and knocked on a door and tried to hassle even one preacher about this, really. You know, I keep to myself, and I do my thing, and I live, you know, a private life, and I don't really want to make waves. You know, I don't even make great plans, you know, when I come in and do these little video things of mine. I don't really have an agenda, and I hope that that's clear. I don't really plan on trying to propagandize the whole world. I feel like truth is truth, and it speaks for itself. And as long as I seek truth, and as long as I communicate truth to the best of my ability, then the truth will out. And if I miss the mark, I miss the mark. But, you know, unlike a lot of the rhetoric that I see on, you know, television ministries, or that I read in books or magazines or whatever, it's very clear that people have some kind of agenda going on. There are a lot of sincere people, and I'm not talking about them. Um, but anytime you adopt a stance, you have to maintain that stance. And I don't like to be that tied down to something that's that dogmatic. Yes, I do believe in certain truths, like I was saying about keys and principles, and the understanding of parables. But to me, that's where the action is. That's where the really important, juicy things are, is in the mysteries. And people want to talk about morality. Yeah, morality plays a part. In fact, it's a vital role. You can't just go and do your own thing and get into any kind of sin you want to and still be thinking about God. And it does. It takes thinking about God and having a relationship with God in order for these things to come to you. So naturally, morality does play into it. But it's not all about morality. It really does take some insight. It really does take some knowledge. And what I'm saying is, if you can grab hold of something, just something, a good lead. One of the things that I said in my previous tracks, in my previous tape, was the very first thing that you read in the book of John was, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh. Paraphrasing, of course. So that it seems pretty obvious that if Jesus was the Word, and the Word became flesh, of course, Jesus was this Word, and He was the Word incarnate, then it must be that what Jesus did in the flesh was a parable about the Word in the world. Because Jesus came down into the world, so therefore the Word must have come down into the world. That Jesus must have reached out and preached to people, and so therefore the Word must have reached out and preached towards people. And Jesus was opposed by the religious authorities, and so therefore the Word must have been opposed by the religious authorities. That Jesus was railroaded by the religious authorities, and so therefore the Word must have been railroaded by the religious authorities. And it goes on and on. I mean, the Word was put on trial, the Word, was buried, and the Word arose on the third day, just the same as Jesus. So in other words, Jesus came and lived a parable about the Word, so that whatever happened to Jesus happened to the Word, and whatever Jesus did, basically the Word did. And so the Word endured the same sufferings as Jesus. Well, this is a very old mystery. This is stated in so many words, in fact, in the Acts of John, that it must have been known to these ancient authorities. There's no way. This is the smoking gun. And this is what I'm talking about, being where the action is. Because when I say that, I take a very simple principle that every Christian who's ever read the Bible has read that first thing in John. You don't have to dig for it. It's right there. And as a matter of fact, when people read "in the beginning was the Word," that is very misleading. People have tried to make that in the image of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So therefore, in the beginning was the Word. But it's not just a word about sequence or a word about history, like a beginning point. It means the first place as well. And so in English terminology, if I say "in the first place" to you, you know that I could be meaning, first of all. But what I'm more likely to be talking about is a set of principles. In the first place, there's this, then there's that, then there's that. So I'm talking about a series of guiding principles, or a series of things that you have to understand, foundations to build upon. If I told you that it was in the first place, there was but one Word, and this Word was with God, and the Word was God, and so on, and this Word became flesh, you understand it as a principle, and not so much as a history. So as a principle, you have to understand that you can read that whole book of what Jesus did in terms of what happened to the Word. The Word being railroaded, the Word being put to an open shame, the Word being, beaten and hung upon a cross, and the Word in effect dying. The Word, the mystery, the knowledge, all that stuff. And so if I'm sitting here telling you things that are mysterious, and I'm talking about things that nobody's ever heard before, it is pretty tantalizing to think that all of this vast wealth has been sitting here and nobody's really been working on it. And sad, really, that it takes the likes of me, because, I mean, look at me, I'm nobody, you know, to try and bring this up and to try and fight this fight, you know, which is going to be massive if and when, you know, the religious establishment begins to see it as a threat, which it probably will. I'm too laid back to be too radical about it, but I will be matter of fact about it. There's no way that the traditional opinion can prevail in a fair court of law. You know, it's going to have to be met with a lot of, you know, talk about tradition and, you know, the apostolic succession and church decrees and, you know, the fact that it was not, you know, these things were not universally believed and so on and so forth. And so, you know, you're going to have a lot of that thrown at you if you try to talk to people about it. And you get the occasional person who understands. You know, but by and large, people aren't going to understand, and they're not going to have the patience to sit and listen to you. And so, you know, you really got to work on yourself and your knowledge, but, you know, pass it on if you can and you think it's appropriate. You know, and you don't feel like the person's going to just turn around and use it against you or, you know, defame it or something somehow. Really talking about a revolution, there's just no other way of looking at it. You're talking about things that have not been seen. You're talking about words that have not been heard. You're talking about concepts which have never been thought about. You're talking about documents that have never existed until basically we made them. You know, we made them based on our knowledge, the same as Luke. You know, and so this is kind of untrodden ground or unfallowed ground that we need to break up, or fallow ground that needs to be broken up. We kind of, you know, need to all of us, you know, grab hold of these principles as much as possible, think them through, work them out, see if they work, and then learn from them what they say. Because all of this has basically been, for me, a journey of discovery and of finding more and more truth and more principles to this effect. And I have never come across a key that didn't say the same thing, that ultimately it all ties together. And so, on top of everything else, everything that you learn in terms of the mystery, in terms of taking this knowledge and applying it, reinforces the theory. So that after you learn key after key after key, and you just simply take it and apply it, you know, and you apply it to previous keys that you've known, and those unlock other keys, and so on and so on and so forth. But you know what this, and this mean, and so therefore this must be the other thing, you know. So, you know, it's a constant thing, finding new discoveries and working them out and thinking them through. And I have had occasions where, you know, I thought I was onto something, and then I realized that I wasn't. But even on those occasions, 9 times out of 10, even though I started out on the wrong trail, I ended up finding the right one. So they were not without fruit. They weren't empty, you know, meaningless adventures. They were actually a quest for the truth. And so I found this principle to be useful under every circumstance, whether I was really onto something or whether I wasn't. That if I wasn't onto something, that soon I would be. Because you have to follow these things consistently. But that consistency pays off. Because ultimately, the payoff is this, a single coherent word. You might say the fulfillment of all this prophecy, the fulfillment of everything that these people fought and died for. And if that may seem, you know, a bit dramatic, that's in effect what it has to be. And, you know, not to make like it's some great thing or anything, but it really is. And so, you know, I can't deny the greatness of the discovery. It's amazing to me, and it's mind-boggling, and it's hard to believe on some level, and yet there it is, you know, and I can't deny the fact that it exists. And so, you know, here we have the key maybe to opening up this